Toddler saw a German shepherd sleeping near a dollhouse. What happened next left all crying. The sound was barely there, a soft cry, hidden beneath concrete and chaos. What followed was a journey so unbelievable, even those who witnessed it struggled to explain it. This is the kind of story that hurts your heart and then heals it. If you've ever doubted kindness, stay with us. This one's for you. Like, share, and subscribe for more. The evening had settled softly over Willow Creek, the kind of small American town where days ended in slow motion and nights arrived with a gentle sigh. The last rays of sunlight stretched across the sky, painting it in streaks of gold and rose, while a cool breeze whispered through the old yard behind a weather-beaten farmhouse. The grass bent and swayed, brushing against the edges of forgotten toys scattered near the porch. Somewhere in the distance, the chirping of crickets rose and fell like a lullaby, while fireflies flickered in and out of existence, carrying with them the magic of twilight. Near the edge of the yard, a little girl of only 3, wearing her favorite blue dress, was lost in her own world of play. Her hair, soft and golden, caught the dying sunlight as she skipped barefoot across the lawn, her tiny hands clutching a doll whose stitched smile had faded with years of love. She laughed softly to herself as she lined up her toys, talking to them as if they understood every word. The innocence of childhood filled every movement, every breath, every giggle that floated into the evening air. But something made her stop. A feeling, no, more like a tug at her heart, drew her gaze toward the far corner of the garden. There, half hidden by tall weeds and dandelions, stood her old dollhouse. Once painted bright pink, its wooden walls were now faded and chipped, its tiny windows cracked. It had been her mother's toy long before it was hers, and though no one paid it much attention anymore, she still visited it sometimes, placing crumbs inside as though her dolls might truly eat. Yet tonight, the dollhouse looked different. The little girl tilted her head, squinting at the shadows. At first, it seemed only the weeds had grown taller, swallowing the miniature roof and broken shutters. But then she saw it. Right beside the dollhouse, curled into himself as though the world had turned too cruel, was a German shepherd. Her breath caught. The dog was so still that, for a moment, she thought he might not be alive. His fur was tangled with dirt and leaves, and his ribs rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. One paw stretched awkwardly across the ground, scratched and raw, while his ears twitched faintly at the sound of her steps. The sight was both strange and heartbreaking. A noble animal, once proud, now reduced to a shadow of himself beside a toy house long abandoned. Her tiny fingers tightened around her doll. Was he dangerous? That's what grown-ups always said, stray dogs bite, stray dogs can't be trusted. Yet, as she stood there, barefoot in the grass, she didn't feel fear. She felt something else entirely, sadness, the kind too big for her small body to carry, and an ache that whispered he didn't belong out here alone. The breeze lifted the hem of her dress as she took a slow step closer. The shepherd didn't move. Another step. Still no growl, no flash of teeth, only the faint rise and fall of his chest. She crouched down in the wet grass, her doll slipping from her hand as her other palm pressed carefully to the ground for balance. The dog's eyes were still closed, his breath uneven. He looked lost, forgotten, like the dollhouse beside him. "Hi," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the rustling leaves. For a moment, nothing happened. The stillness was heavy, stretching like the pause between heartbeats. Then, slowly, the shepherd's head lifted. His eyes, weary and rimmed with sorrow, opened just enough to find hers. In that quiet meeting of gazes, child and dog, something unspoken passed between them. Not danger, not fear, but recognition. And though no one else saw it, no one else heard it, that moment marked the beginning of a story that would change everything. The dollhouse in the corner of the yard had once been the pride of the Harper family. Years ago, it had been painted a cheerful pink by a young mother who wanted her daughter to have something beautiful, something magical. Its little shutters once opened and closed, its painted flowers once looked bright, and its tiny wooden door had squeaked when pushed open. That was a long time ago. Seasons had come and gone, storms had battered its fragile roof, and time had faded the colors into muted shades of gray and brown. Now the dollhouse stood weathered and leaning, its paint peeling, its windows cracked, a shadow of what it once had been. It was more than just a toy. It had become a symbol, holding memories of love once poured into it, now left behind like a forgotten chapter. For the toddler in the blue dress, however, the dollhouse still lived. She was only 3, too young to care about chipped paint or splintered wood. To her, it was still a place of stories. She would kneel beside it in the grass, carrying bits of bread or tiny crumbs from the kitchen, and gently place them inside as if her dolls truly ate them. Sometimes, she whispered secrets into its crooked door, giggling softly as if someone inside could hear her. She gave life to what the world had abandoned, breathing innocence into wood that had been silent for years. She lived with her grandparents now, in the same farmhouse her mother had once run barefoot around as a child. Life had not been easy. Her parents, caught in struggles too heavy for love to carry, had separated, leaving the little girl's world quieter, lonelier. Her grandparents did their best. They filled her days with warmth, with small joys, with gentle care. But there was still a kind of emptiness, an absence of the voices she used to hear at night, the embrace of parents who were no longer together. Perhaps that was why she loved the dollhouse so much. It was something that still held pieces of her mother's laughter, her touch, her time. On that quiet evening, as the sky turned darker and the air heavy with nightfall, the little girl wandered to the dollhouse again. She clutched one of her dolls in her small hands, her bare feet brushing against the cool grass. She expected to see the same chipped walls, the same cracked roof. But instead, she froze. Beside the dollhouse lay a German shepherd. At first glance, he seemed almost like a shadow stretched across the ground. His body curled tightly as though he were trying to make himself disappear. Dust clung to his fur, and patches of dirt marked his coat. His ribs were visible with each shallow breath, his paws scraped raw from wandering too long on unfriendly ground. Scars lined his legs and sides, faint but telling, a map of a life that had not been kind. His ears drooped flat, too heavy to stand tall, as though even his spirit had forgotten what pride felt like. And yet, of all the places he could have chosen in the wide woods and endless fields, he had chosen the dollhouse. His large body pressed against the tiny wooden frame, as though he had searched the world for shelter, and this broken toy was the only place that felt safe. To an adult, it might have seemed strange. But to a child, it was perfect sense. Perhaps, deep down, the shepherd knew. He knew the dollhouse carried echoes of love, of warmth, of home, even if it was only pretend. The little girl tilted her head, her soft hair falling across her cheek. She clutched her doll tighter, unsure if she should run back to her grandparents or step closer. But then her wide eyes softened. She saw not danger, but loneliness. The dog wasn't growling, wasn't baring teeth. He was trembling, lost in exhaustion, as though life had wrung out every ounce of his strength. Slowly, she lowered herself to the ground, knees pressing into the grass. She stared at him, and he at her, though his eyes opened only halfway, clouded with fatigue. Her small hands shook slightly, but not with fear, with something deeper. Pity. Compassion. That unexplainable pull children feel when they see a creature weaker than themselves. Without a word, she lifted her doll, the one with the faded smile and loose arm. Carefully, she placed it in the grass beside the German shepherd's head, right next to his tired muzzle. To her, it wasn't just a doll. It was her way of saying, "You're not alone. You have a friend now." The shepherd blinked, his weary eyes falling upon the doll. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with the smallest, weakest motion, his nose nudged toward it, inhaling as if trying to understand the gift. The little girl's lips curved into a small smile, her heart swelling with something even she couldn't name. In her innocence, she had offered companionship where the world had offered only neglect. And though the night deepened, though the wind carried whispers of storms to come, something had already begun in that forgotten corner of the yard. A child and a dog, bound by sorrow and solitude, had found each other. Not with words, not with promises, but with a simple gesture beside a broken dollhouse that still remembered what it meant to be loved. The little girl stayed crouched near the forgotten dollhouse, her doll still lying beside the exhausted German shepherd. She didn't move away. Something in her heart told her she couldn't. His shallow breaths, the faint rise and fall of his chest, the way his paws trembled as if even resting was painful, it was all too much for her small, innocent world to ignore. To her, it wasn't just a dog. It was someone hurting, someone crying for help in silence. Her grandparents, who had been watching from the porch with worried eyes, finally noticed the strange sight. The old man's brow furrowed deeply as he rose from his chair, his voice low with concern. "Sweetheart, come back here. That's not safe." His wife echoed his worry, clutching the edge of her shawl. "Strays can be dangerous, Lily. You don't know where they've been, what they might do." But Lily only shook her head. Her golden hair swayed against her cheeks, damp from the rising night breeze. "He's not dangerous," she whispered, her voice small but steady. "He's sad." The words cut through the air heavier than thunder. For a moment, her grandparents froze, their hearts tugged in opposite directions. On one side, there was logic, experience, caution. Stray dogs often carried scars, sometimes on their bodies, sometimes in their temper. On the other side, there was the undeniable purity of a child's instinct. Where they saw danger, she saw pain. Where they felt hesitation, she felt duty. The German shepherd stirred slightly, his head lifting just enough for his dull eyes to meet the toddler's. His tail didn't wag, his ears didn't perk up. But in that weak gaze, there was no threat, no menace. Only exhaustion. "Come here, darling," her grandmother urged, her voice pleading now. "Let Grandpa handle this. Dogs that have been hurt, they might bite." But Lily didn't move. Instead, she did something that made her grandfather's heart almost stop. She leaned closer to the dollhouse window, the broken frame jagged but just wide enough, and slid her tiny hand through. The shepherd blinked slowly. His ribs shifted with a shaky breath. And then, instead of snapping, instead of growling like her grandparents feared, he did something no one expected. He lifted his muzzle with effort and pressed his nose gently to her fingers. A soft lick followed, weak, trembling, but filled with a kind of gratitude words could never capture. The yard went quiet, save for the distant rumble of thunder. The old man's throat tightened. His wife gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hand. Lily's face lit up with a tender smile, her small fingers curling around the shepherd's fur through the opening. "See," she said softly, glancing back at them. "He just needed someone." Above them, dark clouds gathered, the first cool drops of rain pattering against the grass. The air thickened, the scent of an approaching storm riding the wind. The atmosphere mirrored the tension in the yard, a fragile balance between fear and hope, between caution and compassion. The old man stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel path. His voice was gruff, but not unkind. "Lily, come away now. If he's sick or hurt, we'll call someone in town tomorrow." But the little girl shook her head again, her hand never leaving the dog's side. "Tomorrow is too late. He needs us now." It was such a simple statement, spoken with such innocence that it struck him harder than any argument. He remembered when her mother, as a child, used to defend stray cats with the same fearless conviction. He remembered the way she once cried over a bird with a broken wing, insisting it could be healed if only someone cared. And now here stood her daughter, carrying that same unshakable heart, as if compassion itself was passed down like an heirloom. A flash of lightning lit up the sky, illuminating the fragile scene. A toddler in a blue dress kneeling beside a weathered dollhouse, her tiny hand inside, and a battered German shepherd leaning against her touch. It was a portrait of innocence meeting pain, of love challenging fear. The grandfather exhaled slowly. His shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in recognition. He could no longer argue. He had lived long enough to know children sometimes saw truths adults forgot, that sometimes the smallest voices carried the deepest wisdom. "All right," he said finally, his voice softer now. "I'll take a look." Lily turned toward him, her eyes shining, a smile of relief spreading across her face. She didn't cheer or clap or say thank you. She simply looked back at the shepherd, as if silently promising him that help was finally here. And as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall in earnest, the old man knew he had witnessed something far greater than a child's stubbornness. He had witnessed the moment innocence won against caution, compassion against fear. A moment that would change not just the fate of a dog, but perhaps the heart of an entire town. The storm's breath grew heavier as the family gathered near the corner of the yard where the old dollhouse leaned against the garden fence. Its once bright paint was chipped away by years of rain and sun, its little windows cracked, its roof sagging inward. And now, as if destiny had chosen this forgotten relic for a purpose, a battered German shepherd lay tangled against its wooden frame. His paw had slipped deep between the broken slats, wedged in the splintered remains. Every attempt to move only made him whimper, the sharp sound cutting through the night air like glass. Lily knelt closer, her tiny hands shaking but her heart unyielding. "It's okay," she whispered, as if her words alone could soothe the creature's pain. Her grandfather crouched a few feet away, his flashlight beam darting over the dog's body. The light revealed the truth that was harder to bear. Ribs sharp against stretched skin, fur matted with dirt, and scars across his side that told of battles and neglect. Yet despite his suffering, when Lily reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of bread from dinner, the shepherd lifted his nose weakly, sniffing with the last fragments of strength. "Don't get too close," her grandmother warned from the porch, wringing her hands anxiously. "If he panics." But the caution came too late. Lily had already broken the crust in half, sliding her small hand toward the cage-like corner of the dollhouse. The shepherd, rather than snapping, took the offering gently, his teeth brushing her skin without malice. He chewed slowly, eyes never leaving hers, as if the food itself mattered less than the kindness behind it. The old man exhaled, the beam of his flashlight trembling. "He trusts her," he murmured to himself, shaking his head in disbelief. "Only her." Thunder growled overhead, and fat raindrops began to fall, turning the earth soft beneath their knees. Mud splattered across Lily's dress, but she didn't flinch. She only pressed closer, clutching a small lantern in her other hand, its flickering glow mixing with the storm's light. The shepherd whimpered again, trying to pull free, but the jagged would bit deeper into his paw. His cries grew sharper, and Lily's eyes filled with tears. "Grandpa," she pleaded, looking up at the man who had raised her since her parents' separation. "Please help him. He can't do it alone." The old man set the flashlight between his teeth and dropped to his knees beside the dollhouse. His weathered hands probed carefully around the trapped paw, careful not to hurt the dog further. "It's stuck good," he muttered, his voice muffled by the storm. He reached for the small crowbar he had grabbed from the tool shed, wedging it against the warped slats. The wood creaked and groaned, refusing to give way easily. The shepherd whimpered louder, his breathing ragged. Lily leaned close, her hand resting softly against his head. "Shoo," she whispered, her voice trembling with childlike tenderness. "It's going to be okay. We're here now." The old man pressed harder, mud soaking into his trousers as the rain poured down in earnest. Each shove of the crowbar sent splinters flying, but the wood held stubbornly. His muscles strained, his breath came in huffs, yet for every grunt of effort, he saw the way his granddaughter's hand never wavered, how her little lantern never tilted away from the dog's face. The shepherd's eyes softened, the panic in them fading bit by bit, not because the pain was gone, but because a child refused to abandon him. Then it happened, the miracle moment. With one last heave, the wood snapped. The shepherd's paw came free, his body collapsing sideways into the mud. For an instant, everyone froze. The rain fell harder, the thunder roared louder, and then Lily gasped softly as the dog shifted, dragging himself weakly until his head found the place it sought most. Her lap. The German shepherd lowered his battered head into the folds of her muddy blue dress, his chest rising and falling in uneven waves. His tail twitched once, faint, but undeniable. Lily's tears fell onto his fur as she wrapped her small arms around him, unafraid of the dirt, the scars, or the danger her grandparents had warned about. He had chosen her, and in that choice lay a trust deeper than words. Her grandfather sat back on his heels, the crowbar dropping into the mud with a dull thud. For a long moment he said nothing. The storm raged around them, soaking his hat and drenching his shirt, but none of it mattered. He was watching something far greater than a rescue. He was watching the birth of a bond, forged not by logic or caution, but by innocence and love. The old dollhouse creaked in the wind, its broken windows glowing faintly with the lantern's light. Once a forgotten relic of childhood, it now stood as the silent witness of a miracle, the place where despair met hope, where cruelty met compassion. And as the German shepherd closed his eyes, comforted for the first time in who knew how long, the old man whispered hoarsely, "He's not just free, Lily, he's finally home." The storm finally softened into a drizzle, the thunder rolling farther away into the hills. The yard smelled of rain-soaked earth and pine, the kind of scent that always lingered after a long fight with the skies. Inside the old red barn, a single lantern flickered, its glow dancing across wooden beams and casting long shadows that seemed almost protective. It was here, within those warm and weathered walls, that the German shepherd's second chance at life began. Lily's grandfather carried the weakened dog carefully through the doorway, his muscles protesting against the weight, though the shepherd was far thinner than he should have been. Mud dripped from the animal's fur, splattering the hay-strewn floor, but Lily followed right behind, her little blue dress damp and her bare feet muddy, refusing to let the distance between them grow more than a step. She clutched her lantern tightly, as though its light belonged only to him. "Set him down gently," her grandmother urged, spreading an old quilt across a pile of straw. The fabric had once been part of a bedspread, faded with years of washing, but in that moment it became a throne for a king rediscovered. The old man lowered the dog carefully, and the shepherd collapsed onto his side, breathing heavily, his ribs still heaving like bellows struggling for air. Lily knelt beside him at once. She touched his ear softly, whispering, "You're safe now." The grandfather fetched a basin of warm water, the steam rising faintly into the barn's cool air. He dipped a rag into it and began to wipe the mud from the shepherd's coat. At first, the dog tensed, a low groan escaping his throat, but when Lily pressed her tiny hand on his head, he stilled. The rag moved more easily then, across his paws, his back, his face. Each stroke revealed more of his true self beneath the filth. Patches of golden fur, streaks of sable, scars that spoke of pain and survival. "Look here," the old man muttered, his brow furrowed as he examined the neck. Beneath the wet fur were raw, pink lines, deep grooves where a collar must have once been strapped too tightly for too long. Just above his shoulders, rope burns etched into his skin like cruel signatures of a forgotten master. The grandmother gasped softly, covering her mouth. Who could do such a thing? But Lily, too young to understand the weight of cruelty, only tilted her head in innocence. "He doesn't have to wear it anymore," she whispered. With delicate fingers, she patted the scars as if smoothing them away. The old man sighed, wrapping a dry blanket gently over the shepherd's trembling frame. "You've carried enough chains." A shallow bowl of broth and softened bread was set before him, but he didn't move. His nose twitched, his body wanted it, but his eyes stayed fixed on Lily. Only when she sat cross-legged beside the bowl, her doll tucked into her lap, did the shepherd inch forward. Slowly, carefully, he lapped at the broth, glancing back at her between each mouthful. To the adults, it seemed strange. To Lily, it was simple. He would eat because she was there, because trust had found its first fragile root. The hours stretched softly in that barn. Rain tapped lightly against the tin roof. Crickets began their night song, and the lantern's flame hummed low. Lily, fighting sleep, took her doll by the arms and began to hum the lullaby her mother once sang. The tune was broken, childlike, more memory than melody, but to the shepherd it was something deeper. His ears twitched. His breathing slowed. His tail, still muddy, gave the faintest wag, tapping against the straw in rhythm to her humming. His eyes half closed, not in fear, but in peace. The grandfather leaned on the stall door, watching silently. He had seen animals stitched back from the edge of death, had seen medicine mend bodies, but this was different. No medicine could stitch a soul. Yet here, in the soft hum of a toddler's lullaby, a broken spirit was being sewn back together thread by thread. The grandmother brushed a tear from her cheek. "It's like he knows her song," she whispered. "No," the old man corrected quietly. "It's like he's been waiting for it." And so, the barn became more than shelter. It became a sanctuary. A place where scars were not just cleaned, but understood. Where pain was met with presence. Where healing did not come from ointments or bandages, but from love in its purest, smallest form. A child who refused to let go. That night, as the lantern finally dimmed and the family tiptoed back to the farmhouse, Lily stayed behind just a little longer. She leaned close to the shepherd's ear and whispered, "Good night." His eyes blinked once, heavy but grateful, and his tail brushed the straw again. The bond was silent, but it was sealed. Healing had begun, not with medicine, but with love. The story of the German shepherd spread faster than the last summer storm that had rattled Willowbrook. By the next morning, neighbors were whispering in grocery aisles, church pews, and along the wooden fences that divided their backyards. The tale wasn't about a stray anymore. It was about a dog who had chosen to collapse beside a broken dollhouse, as if waiting for someone pure enough to see his suffering. And the one who saw him was not a sheriff, not a farmer, not a strong man. It was Lily, a 3-year-old in a blue dress. The neighbors came in small groups, baskets of food in their arms, curiosity in their eyes. They stood around the barn where the shepherd rested, their faces shifting from pity to outrage as Lily's grandfather told them how they had found him. His ribs sharp against his skin, scars on his neck, paws torn raw. It was more than misfortune. It was cruelty. "Dogs don't end up like that on accident," muttered Mrs. Thompson, the town baker, clutching her apron as though it might shield her from the thought. "Someone did this." The sheriff, a broad-shouldered man named Hank Whitaker, arrived before noon. His boots left deep prints in the mud as he walked to the barn, his hat pulled low, his eyes sharp with suspicion. Hank had been in Willowbrook his whole life. He had seen barns burn, rivers flood, and families fall apart. But this kind of suffering, deliberate and silent, always hit him hardest. He crouched beside the shepherd, running his hand gently along the scars at his neck, tracing the deep grooves left by rope or a chain. His frown deepened. "These aren't from wandering loose," he said quietly. "These are from restraint, tight, harsh, and long-term." Lily stood nearby, clutching her doll. She didn't understand all of his words, but she understood his tone. Fear flickered in her eyes. "No one's going to take him away, are they?" she whispered. Her grandfather rested a hand on her shoulder. "Not while I'm breathing." Sheriff Hank stood slowly, his jaw tightening. "I'll need to look into this." This wasn't just neglect. This was abandonment. Deliberate. The neighbors traded uneasy glances. Some already had suspicions, names that drifted like smoke through the quiet town. And though no one wanted to say them too loudly, everyone knew who made money in shadows. Later that evening, the sheriff returned with confirmation. The scars, the condition of the shepherd, the fact he had been tangled near the dollhouse rather than wandering, it all matched a troubling rumor. There had been whispers about a man on the edge of town, a man known more for greed than kindness. Carl Jennings. He bred dogs for profit, traded them without records, and when one grew too old, too sick, or too broken, he found ways to discard them like old tools. "He treats them like property, not living souls," Hank told the grandparents grimly. "And this one? He was trained once, maybe even worked. You can see it in his build, the way his body holds tension." But when Jennings decided he wasn't profitable anymore, his voice trailed off, heavy with disgust. Lily, too young to follow every detail, only heard the word Jennings. Her small brows knitted. "He's not allowed to take him back," she said firmly, her voice carrying more weight than her size. Her grandmother smiled sadly. "No, sweet pea. Not ever again." The barn became more than a shelter. It became a meeting place. Neighbors brought blankets, medicine, even old toys for Lily to keep the shepherd company. Each visit carried the same refrain: disbelief that someone could be so cruel, and awe at the child who had been brave enough to notice. Soon people were calling her the guardian angel of the dollhouse, a title she didn't fully grasp but one that made her giggle when whispered in admiration. But as compassion grew in one corner of the town, so too did fear in another. Rumors spread that Jennings had noticed the attention, that he wasn't happy about losing a dog he still considered his. Some said he had been seen drinking at the tavern, muttering about "what was mine." Others claimed he had asked around, trying to find out exactly where the shepherd had been taken. The grandparents locked their doors more tightly at night. The sheriff promised to keep watch, but tension hung in the air like the heavy humidity before a storm. Every creak of the barn door, every set of headlights rolling down the road after dark, made hearts pound a little faster. And through it all, the shepherd stayed close to Lily. Wherever she toddled, whether to her dollhouse, her swing, or the old oak tree, he followed, his eyes never leaving her small figure. The scars on his body remained, but his loyalty became a shield of its own. What Jennings had discarded as worthless, Lily had turned into priceless. What was once abandoned was now adored. The townsfolk began to realize something. The little girl's innocence was stronger than any cruelty, her compassion louder than any greed. But beneath that beauty, a shadow still lingered. The knowledge that the man who had broken the shepherd might yet return to reclaim what was never truly his. And that possibility made the bond between Lily and the dog not just tender, but urgent. The days that followed brought with them a change no one in Willowbrook had expected, not just for the battered German shepherd, but for the little girl who had found him and for the town itself. Healing, it seemed, did not belong to one heart alone. It spread like ripples across the creek when a single stone is dropped in, reaching shores that had long since forgotten how to feel. The shepherd, once too weak to even stand, began to show signs of life again. At first, it was a cautious lift of his head when Lily entered the barn. Then, a shuffle forward on trembling legs when she held out a piece of bread in her tiny palm. Soon, his steps grew steadier, his ears flicking when she laughed, his eyes softening when she sang her little lullabies to her dolls. One afternoon, as the sun broke through after a week of rain, Lily rolled a rubber ball across the yard. It wobbled unevenly through the grass, stopping near the old oak tree. For a moment, silence held. Then the shepherd, ribs still showing but spirit rekindling, bounded after it. His paws stumbled awkwardly at first, but when he nudged the ball back toward her, Lily clapped her hands in delight, her laughter spilling out like music. It was the first sound of pure joy her grandparents had heard from her in months. From that day on, he became her shadow. He followed her as she toddled around the yard, stood guard at the porch steps when dusk fell, and slept curled at the foot of her bed as though he had always belonged there. The scars on his body remained, but with every wag of his tail, with every soft nudge of his nose against her hand, he showed that scars were not the end of a story, they were proof of survival. The neighbors noticed, and their hearts stirred. They brought food and medicine for the shepherd, old blankets to line the barn floor, and even toys for Lily to share with her new companion. What began as a whisper of sympathy grew into an act of collective kindness. It wasn't just about the dog anymore. It was about a child who had reminded them all of something they'd forgotten, that compassion was not weakness, but strength. One neighbor, Mr. Carter, a carpenter with rough hands and a soft heart, arrived one morning with his toolkit. He stood beside the weathered dollhouse, its roof sagging, its paint chipped, its walls broken from years of neglect. "This old thing has seen better days," he muttered, kneeling to touch its frame. "But if a dog saw it as a safe place, then maybe it deserves another chance, just like him." What followed became one of the most moving gatherings the town had ever seen. Men brought wood and nails, women brought paint and brushes, children carried ribbons and small decorations. Together, they rebuilt the dollhouse, not as a toy now, but as a shelter, sturdy and warm, with a little roof to shield from rain and a soft bed inside. They even carved a small wooden sign above the doorway, "Guardian's Home." Lily stood proudly beside the shepherd as the neighbors stepped back to admire their work. Her blue dress swayed in the evening breeze, her cheeks pink with excitement. "It's for him," she said softly, placing her hand on the shepherd's fur. "So he knows he's safe." The dog, as if understanding, wagged his tail and pressed closer to her, his head lowering gently into her small arms. That evening, the townspeople lingered longer than usual, unwilling to let go of the moment. Some brought guitars and fiddles, their music filling the air with warmth. Others lit lanterns that glowed softly against the night. Children ran barefoot across the grass, their laughter echoing through the valley. And in the center of it all sat Lily and the shepherd, her giggles mixing with the crackle of lantern flames, his steady presence grounding them all in the simple truth that love, once given, multiplies. From then on, people in Willowbrook didn't just see a stray dog. They saw a survivor, a symbol of loyalty that endured cruelty, of hope that outlived despair. And they didn't just see Lily as a child. They saw her as the guardian angel of the dollhouse, the one whose innocence had sparked a rebirth in their hearts. It wasn't long before visitors from neighboring towns came to see the shepherd and the little girl who had saved him. They left with stories that carried beyond county lines, tales of a child who had chosen compassion when others chose fear, and of a community that rediscovered its soul because of it. Every evening, as the lanterns in the yard glowed and the dollhouse shelter stood proud, the people of Willowbrook knew they had been changed. The shepherd no longer cried alone in the shadows. The girl no longer laughed only in her dreams. Together, they had brought life back into a forgotten corner of the town. And in that union of innocence and survival, the whole town was reborn. Sometimes, the faintest cries carry the loudest truths. In the quiet of that evening, when a child's ears caught what the rest of the world ignored, everything changed. A German shepherd left to suffer in silence became more than just a rescue story. He became a reminder that loyalty does not fade even when the world turns cruel, and that hope can rise from the most forgotten corners. For the people of Willowbrook, the shepherd's survival became a lesson in devotion. He guarded the little girl not because he had to, but because love, once given freely, cannot be contained. And for Lily, her innocence became a light against the shadows, proving that healing doesn't always come from medicine or time. Sometimes, it comes from love, pure, fearless, unselfish love. Scars remained, both on the dog's body and in the town's memory, but those scars no longer spoke only of pain. They spoke of survival. They whispered of compassion's power to turn cruelty into kindness, despair into hope, silence into laughter. This was not just the story of a little girl and her dog. It was a reminder to us all that even the smallest hands can make the biggest difference, that even the faintest voice can awaken an entire town, that loyalty, once earned, never fades. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in love that heals and loyalty that endures. Like, comment, and tell us where you're watching from, because stories like these deserve to be carried far and wide.